Hello, and welcome back to Covering Ukraine. I am your host for this episode. My name is Sarah Lepers, and I am the editorial coordinator of the Europe-Ukraine desk. I'm delighted to introduce you to a new series of episodes that invite you to dive into special events organized by n-ost in Kyiv. We call them Kyiv Media Hubs, and each of them tackles a different topic around journalism and journalists in Ukraine. The first Kyiv Media Hub happened in May 2023 and questioned the way European journalists report on Ukraine in Ukraine. The moderator for the discussion was Anna Myroniuk from the Kyiv Independent. She brought her expertise as the head of investigations and she questioned a panel of distinguished journalists. Among them are Isobel Koshiw, a seasoned correspondent for The Guardian, FT, Washington Post, and many others. Vlad Golovin from Forbes Ukraine, Olivia Kortas, Kyiv correspondent for Die Zeit, and Anastasia Vlasova, known for her photojournalism published in The Guardian, Los Angeles Times, The Washington Post, Der Spiegel, and many others. We talk about balancing interests, self-censorship, and many more topics. I will now leave you in Anna's capable hands to guide the conversation.
And I would like to address my first question to Olivia. After the start of the full-scale Russian invasion, many prominent media outlets started opening Kyiv offices and started reporting on Ukraine on the ground instead of doing something that they had previously done by reporting on Ukraine from their Moscow offices. Do you see the difference between the coverage that had been there before the full-scale invasion of last year and starting from 2014?
Yeah, I think there's multiple factors. I can mostly speak for the German media landscape because I'm writing for the Germans, and we actually don't have that many correspondents who stay here all the time. The public broadcaster, for example, ARD, they are building an office with multiple journalists, and also Die Zeit, they send me now. But many of my other colleagues, they are rotating and they're here for a short amount of time. So it's not somebody staying in the country for a long time. And I think, yeah, we do see a lot of differences because journalists who have covered Ukraine before for Germany, they have been based in other countries. Mostly it was in Russia, it was Moscow. Also one of my colleagues, he lives in Warsaw. He's been covering Kyiv. And what then happened was that they would come in for elections mostly, for major events, but they wouldn't spend and I wouldn't spend my daily life here either, so we wouldn't spend our daily lives here. And I think when you are what for me was very eye-opening when I started covering Ukraine after the full-scale invasion, was that whatever I came up with on my desk in Berlin, I come here and the topics are actually not the topics that I would want to cover, because when I walk the streets, I find different stories. And I think this makes the biggest difference. Being here, you just see more, you're covering what is actually important and not what you think might be important when you're in Berlin.
How do these themes differ? Could you bring us a couple examples, maybe?
What, for example, interests me is the housing market. Whenever I open also Ukrainian media, and I think you probably know that very well from the Kyiv Independent, there's a lot of talk about how people can rebuild their houses, what the government does for them. And when I was covering the refugees coming in the first 3 weeks of the war, housing was all the time a topic that would come up because they would tell me, yeah, but we're worried about our house. And also when they returned back, it was always we don't know what we'll find. So those topics I couldn't come up with in Germany, but here people tell me about it all the time. So I think it must be an important topic. And I don't know, maybe it is not. I'll find out when I start researching it. But this is how the process differs.
Thank you a lot, Olivia. Isobel, since 2014, there were so many misconceptions about Ukraine in the international media, for example, on topics of, Azov, Ukraine's battalion, or, there were many issues, for example, about Donetsk. People there were referred to as rebels at times, which is not the right word to use in this context. So would you say that after after the full-scale invasion, the situation with the wording and with understanding of Ukraine has changed.
So yeah, no, absolutely, it's changed. I still think it has a very, very, very long way to go. I think with the invasion, it was so black and white, it was so simple for people to sort of grasp. But even when people look back at what happened in 2014, like in the media, they still sort of use those terms, and they still can't quite believe Ukrainians when Ukrainians say, no, it was actually this way. So I think there's this concept in academia at the moment, it's called like epistemic injustice, where basically it's usually used to refer to people of color, like in America, or like Native Americans, where their side of the story is just not believed. Like they're not classed as people who have the right to have knowledge, and so I think it's still a big problem, and I think I still see that a lot with editors. I think that, like, you know, pro-Russian rebel, pro-Russian separatist, etc., is still used with no kind of explanation of what actually happened and why it happened. And like, I think if you take like what happened in 2014, that was a special operation. Like, it was like they were very successful in convincing the world of their narrative, and then what happened this year, like they just completely messed up basically. And so I think there's still a long way to go. I think because so many people have been based in Moscow for so many years, like that kind of journalistic knowledge which was built up in Moscow and other places over like 100 years, you know, journalists were always based there, just hasn't had the same sort of, Ukraine just hasn't yet had the same number of people learning about it. So I think there's still just like a massive generational gap. And I think there's also this thing of people don't want to admit that they don't know. So when Ukrainians tell them, no, it's not this way, they'd rather just say, no, we know better, rather than actually go to the effort of learning about something new. I guess that's my kind of take, yeah.
Also wanted to follow up, Isobel, with the, how do you believe the knowledge of local context and knowledge of background of local politicians impact your reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, I think, especially at the beginning of the invasion, like politics sort of disappeared in a way, and like kind of a greater like narrative took over, and that was, I think, the right thing. And like when people came here, they were doing very much like reactive reporting, like going to a scene, interviewing witnesses, and then just saying, okay, this is what happened, and you know, this is how awful it is. I think particularly now, like, you know, we can see that politics is kind of definitely coming back into the fold. I think in Ukraine, like, you know, nothing is as it seems when you get to like people in power, basically, right? And I think if you don't know that, then like you're going to get yourself into trouble, because you're going to start trusting people and trusting information which you shouldn't be. So yeah, I think it really does matter. I think it's going to matter like more and more as time goes on, especially like next year, next year especially.
Why so?
Because I think, well, first of all, you're going to have, like, we're already getting a lot of investment from the West into reconstruction, already seeing, you know, incidents of corruption, and that's nothing, you know, Ukraine-specific. Corruption happens in every country, including the UK, but it's just, you just have to understand that certain people are going to sell you an idea, and that there are different power groups in Ukraine, different clans, and a lot of people who got to power, in fact, most people who are in power, without exception, got there because they did deals, and they are sort of somebody's person, and if you don't understand who they're working for and why they're there, then you kind of can't analyze the information that they're giving you.
All right, thank you. Let's talk about the access that foreign media and Ukrainian media are having to the front line and to people in power in Ukraine at the moment. Do you guys think that the foreign media and the Ukrainian media are exercising the very same access to people and places? Vladislav, maybe you would like to start? Is the treatment fair? Or...
From my perspective, it depends mainly not only from the media, but mainly from like mediators, which we call the fixers. Of course, if it's like widely known media, like New York Times, Washington Post, or The Guardian, or anybody else like widely known in Ukraine as well, it's easier to arrange any scene, any kind of access. For example, when I'm as a producer, I'm talking with press officers or with some commanders. It's much easier me to name the widely known media because it's a great audience. It's millions of readers, and when it's something not very well known media, it's not very easy. But it mainly depends of the what relationship do you have with your speakers, with the military guys, and because if you know, when I was working like before the full-scale invasion, I was working for Forbes. We covering like a lot of business stories. We usually say like, you know, PR managers were invented to bypass them. It's a like usual joke that when you get you want to get some interview, and PR manager, he is like just creating obstacles for you, and you're just trying to find the way how to go around him to get the contact of the person, of the businessman. And for the first time, I was thinking that it doesn't work for the military. But later,
so the press officers are there to actually help. Always.
Yes, they help, but they always have possibility to help. Besides, there are a lot of extremely good press officers, which I'm impressed of, with reporters' background or communication background. But sometimes I met this very strange attitude among press officers, which are saying, "Oh, this media, they want only to show the blood, only to show the sensation, like," and they do not understand the role of the media. Some of them, and it's extremely hard to communicate. It's not all of them; it's a teeny minority maybe, but they also could create obstacles. So, turning back to the question, it depends from each person, from communication skills of the reporter on the ground and from the fixer on the ground.
Anastasia, would you like to say a few words about the access to the front line? Any obstacles you've faced in this regard?
I mean the same as Vlad was saying about the press officers being as like extremely good and extremely helpful, and I really know like a lot of them. So like first and foremost, they make our work much easier, and they make our work possible first and foremost. And this attitude that kind of surprised me, that I recently acquainted from a press officer. It was a complete misunderstanding of the role of the press officer. He told me, well, I'm here to take the pictures, but and I was a bit shocked because I was thinking that so the person doesn't understand the role of the photojournalist, and also I think that I think that also sometimes they don't understand what stands behind this access, what stands behind the journalist's arrival to this or that position, and it usually, well, it must be, and usually these are years of training, years of reporting on this war, and also doing like first aid trainings and being constantly watching the situation, and also it's not like an easy walk to take. So it is kind of important to emphasize on the role of the media to the press officers on the ground.
Isobel, how much do restrictions that are put in place together with the introduction of martial law impact your work?
So I would say, like, at the beginning it was a big shock actually, because before that, like, the Ukrainian media had been pretty like anti-authority and like very sort of
critical?
Very critical, very open about being critical, very, you know, the media was very much a part of the kind of pushback against like bad things happening here. And, you know, you know, they kind of took away some of those freedoms with that law. So at first it was a bit of a shock, and then you kind of got used to it, and there were definitely certain aspects that you kind of immediately understood, like, you know, when it comes to like the security of the soldiers, like obviously, you know, as a journalist or just as a person, you don't want to endanger people's lives, you don't want to let people know where a base is, and then, you know, a rocket comes and something awful happens. So I think, you know, I think then it kind of moved to the next stage around the time when they were kind of messaging about the Kherson offensive in September, and certain press officer, quite a few of them were kind of releasing new guidelines, like suggestions, although they weren't officially part of the law, which included all kinds of different new things that they kind of just invented on their own, mostly for their own benefit, but which were readily like kind of dismissed, and everyone pretty much said no, like we're not going to follow those because they don't actually, you know, if the ones before made some sort of logical sense and you could see the reasons behind them, these ones didn't. And then I think after the pushback from that, I kind of noticed that things kind of settled into their place, and people just kind of learned to get on with it. You know, still occasionally you get people who post photos of like trails of smoke and rockets, which you're not meant to do, because basically from that, you know, the Ukrainian military says that, you know, Russia can locate where the air defense is, for example, or something like that, like geolocate. So you still get people like breaking the law, but it's mostly sort of, you know, it's mostly the exception. I think the biggest thing now is obviously talking about losses, because it's probably the best kept secret of this war is like how many Ukrainian soldiers have died, and the kind of messaging around that, obviously, for the Ukrainians, they say, well, this is a sort of a military strategic advantage for us to keep this a secret, and yes, you can understand that, but, you know, there's also the question of, like, well, is it also because you don't want to dent morale? Is it also because you've made mistakes that you don't want people to know about? Like, and those are very uncomfortable questions, because ultimately, you know, objectively, Ukraine is the victim of this war, so to then criticize Ukraine on those factors is quite a difficult thing to do, but there's no doubt those kind of incidents have happened, and the way that you kind of report around that and try and continue on reporting on those factors and trying to continue to show like what is actually happening, it is really challenging, because there's a lot of pressure to toe the line, I guess. But yeah.
I would like to ask our Ukraine representatives, do you guys believe that there is room for self-censorship while you are a Ukrainian, being a Ukrainian reporter or photographer, being in Ukraine and having some, you know, personal attachment to the country which you are covering? Is there room for self-censorship?
I had a hard one, just like the day before yesterday. I was photographing the Russian prisoners of war. Well, of course, I was asking if they don't mind being photographed, and all three of them said no. So, well, I mean, showing the face. So I offered them to hide the face, and of course, like, three of them wanted to hide their faces, so I needed to protect their identities. And, well, of course, there is no way that I'm gonna disrespect the will of the person that I photograph. But I would say that now I'm in the process of edit, and I'm gonna share my concerns right now. Because it's all about the details, right? And we know that they are not very, they're like given the clothes by the volunteers, and basically as people who sit in the detention center, they don't look nice and fuzzy, right? And I photographed their clothes, like the way they were dressed, and one of them had a really like cracked boot. So I have a picture of this cracked boot. So I'm thinking now, you know, if I'm going to include that image into an edit, if am I adding to a narrative that these are poor Russian boys or guys or men who didn't understand what they are doing, and now they're struggling in the Ukrainian imprisonment, right? But at the same time, am I going to censor myself and not include that image into the edit? Because, I mean, usually I would do that, right? So that's a tricky question, and I don't think that I have an answer to this one.
Thank you. Vladislav, do you find it as a challenge for yourself? Self-censoring yourself, maybe? Any cases like that?
It's always challenging, but actually I'm doing it on more or less regularly, unfortunately. So when I'm reporting for local media, and when we are like preparing the like big feature, big story, we're doing a lot of different interviews, and like in latest two cases to my stories, I dig a lot of interesting information, which I understand that if I would like cover everything which I know, it definitely will be used by the Russian media as in their information war against us. So I try to bypass this topics and to create some, you know, kind of balanced reporting for these both cases, because I do understand the responsibility which any of us has. You know, that's maybe one of the difference which I noticed between the Ukrainian and foreign reporters. We are at the war. Of course, we are not on the front line, but we are on information war. And Russian propaganda is extremely powerful, and it's not only done for in Russia or in Ukraine, but also in Latin America and Africa and Europe. So we do understand that anything that we will report could be used by Russians against us. So we must always remember about this. And
shall this stop us, though? Because anything can be turned into Russian propaganda, isn't it?
Yes, anything, of course, but it depends from each details in each story.
So we've just moved to the topic of Russian disinformation and misinformation. Do you have any tips on how not to fall victim to Russian disinformation and simultaneously not to become a press office of Ukraine's military and Ukraine's political establishment? Isobel, you want to start?
I mean, I think it's really important for Ukrainian journalists to sort of remain true to themselves and true to the traditions that they built, you know, and like, if you look at all the kind of progress which has happened in Ukraine, like over the last, since independence, so much of that has been driven by journalists, in terms of the Maidans, in terms of publications, in the summer, like yours included, like some very powerful publications happened, which, opens your eyes to the reality rather than just like the nice picture of heroism, which is real and has happened, that, we like people have published about, time again. But I think it is very difficult for like Ukrainian journalists, like often to take themselves out of a situation which they are like, they are a part of. Like these are their families, this is their homes. A lot of Ukrainian journalists like have had parents or relatives like trapped on the occupied territories. Some of them still are. Like, journalists have died at the hands of Russian weapons and Russian soldiers themselves. So I think it is very difficult to sort of separate and take a step back right now. But I do think it's very important, because I don't think what Russia's done here, the fact that there are international criminal lawyers looking at the evidence and concluding that what Russia has done like some of the most heinous like war crimes ever committed, and nothing, you know, in terms of corruption or in terms of, you know, bad people doing kind of things within the Ukrainian state or government, nothing can negate that. Like, you know, that those things can't be taken away from Ukrainians. So I think that Ukrainians shouldn't fear criticism and fear, you know, being true to what their job is, because, you know, ultimately if they don't do it, then you know, people on a national level and international level are going to have a very skewed view of things, and then it's like what Nastia says, it starts turning into some sort of alternative, you know, and I think it's a long way from that still, but, you know, there's a possibility, right? And like, and I think there's always a danger, and I think that's exactly like, I mean, if you look at what happened in Russia, like if you look at what happened like 10 years ago, you know, you had those protests in Moscow, and although it seems like so naive now to think, like people still thought, oh yeah, maybe there'll be a revolution in Russia and maybe something would change, because, you know, there was still sort of a kind of active opposition in some respects, right? And if people could fast forward to then what happened, or even if you went back to Russia in 2000 or in the late 90s, and all these kind of, you know, it was slow, right? It was first the TV channels, then the newspapers, then more and more and more and more pressure, this journalist, that journalist, that journalist. And if you don't stop and say, like, actually, no, like, you know, protect your rights and protect your rights, you know, as a journalist, then you can end up in the same place. It's not impossible, like, you know. So I think it is really important that, like, Ukrainians don't fear, but I do understand that it is you know, Ukrainian journalists are also victims of this war, just by being citizens of Ukraine, and yeah, that's basically what I have to say.
Let's talk about the so-called war fatigue. Russia's war against Ukraine has been ongoing for almost a decade, and I would like to ask you, are there any tips that you would suggest us to use when we are talking about trying to, so to say, sell your story to the editor, trying to keep your editor interested in your Ukraine reporting, and also trying to retain your audience engaged and interested in Ukraine itself?
So yeah, I think that Ukraine, actually, I would say interest is still very high. So I think it was unbelievably high in the first few months of the invasion, and like, you know, this is going to sound crass, but I think all of the UK media and papers reported record like profits. Basically, they had record viewing figures on all their sites, on their channels, and it was all to do with Ukraine. And I think pretty much the same goes for the US, but I haven't read about it in as much detail. And it's still very high, considering that this, for most people, is a foreign country. They don't have a connection to it. People are still very much interested in this like fight, essentially, and the struggle. So I would say it's like remained very high. It obviously has gone down since the first like couple of months. You know, unfortunately, you know, it does take events happening to kind of keep the media interest alive. But ultimately, I think that Ukraine has won a certain level of interest which isn't going to go away anytime soon. So, like, I mean, if you open up like BBC News like any day, like, Ukraine will always be somewhere in the top 10 stories. The same with The Guardian. The same with most British newspapers. So I just think like it will go up and down, but it will always remain like fairly high. So I think, yes, it's going to be, yes, like budgets are going to go down. Yes, there are going to be, you know, perhaps fewer rotations and people coming in. But on the other hand, and I think like Olivia can speak about this a bit more, but like I think that, you know, some people, some sort of, you know, editorial like teams have kind of recognized that there's been this huge like geopolitical shift and the need to have people permanently based here. So you've seen a lot of bureaus open up, particularly American ones. That hasn't happened across the board, and unfortunately I think it will take more events or like whatever happens for that to kind of take place, because like if you look at history, like, still so many newspapers have people based in Warsaw, where like just objectively there's there isn't as much news, right? If you look at the 30-year period of like since Ukraine's independence, so. So it's happening. It's happened at an accelerated rate because of the invasion, but I still think it's kind of, in some places, in some countries, taking a while to get to the stage where people recognise that actually this is in itself a country worth reporting on. So yeah, it's kind of some pluses and minuses, I guess.
Any thoughts?
Yes, I noticed that there is expanding of the topics which international media are covering about Ukraine. If it started from the fighting on the front line or war crimes, then gradually it turned to the different topics of what impact the war has on Ukrainian society. I remember Le Monde made a great special edition about Ukrainian history, starting from the Kyiv and Rus and to the war for independence during the 1917, 1918, and it looks like the international media are started with the war and then explaining what is this country and what is going on and other important topics in this country.
Olivia, are you struggling between your Ukraine stories to your editors?
No, not at all. I'm with the politics desk, but throughout the last couple of weeks, I've got so many requests from colleagues from other desks. If I could write a story, and I just haven't had time yet. So I think I could be two people, and I would still not meet all the requests. So I see there's a huge interest. It's also I hear from our onliners that of course interest has gone down, as Isobel also said. But then there's this decision of reporting on it still. And there's also interest within the society, I would say. When I was in Germany now, I spent all of, I think, March and half of April in Germany. People would come up and they would ask questions because their lives are also influenced by the war in Ukraine, obviously, if it's businessmen and women, or if it's people who are asking, so what about all the families that are now not together anymore? Will the women stay in Germany? Will they get jobs here? And do they, I think there's a lot of blank spaces and a lot of questions coming our way when we are covering this country. And I think, yeah, definitely there's, as Isobel also said, there's going to be a long-term interest, and people always, turn away from misery when it takes too long. It was the same with the refugee crisis. People didn't want to see these pictures anymore. I guess that's something that we have to deal with. It's hard for me to deal with that as well. I once wrote a text about people who basically got injuries that would change their lives forever, and one of the four people I chose to write about then in the article, it was the beginning 2 paragraphs, I think, or not 2 paragraphs, it was full page. It was about a 11-year-old boy who got hit by a cluster bomb, and basically most of his organs were somehow injured, and he was recovering, and I met him 6 months after that happened, and I wrote, and I really chose very, I would say, neutral language, because there's no need in, making this big. It's already very, very dramatic. And many of the commentaries under this text were saying, yeah, I just had to stop after 3 sentences, or I had to stop after 2 paragraphs. Oh, this is so horrible, but I couldn't finish the text. And this is something, I was asking myself then, okay, should I write differently about it? I realized then for myself that probably every human has a certain border, and mine is somewhere, and the reader's is maybe somewhere else. And I think when somebody gets to a point where they say, okay, they don't want to read that anymore, maybe something has already changed. Maybe they have thought about this topic. So saying that, I think there's been a lot of reporting on death, obviously, and there's going to be more reporting on death still, but people just sometimes get tired from that, and I think it comes with waves as well. I think sometimes readers can read it again and then they don't, but overall I think that Ukraine will still be, in Western media, it will be still for a long time important. I hope. I hope so.
Thank you all. One quick question to Isobel, actually a follow-up of something that Olivia just mentioned, which goes in line with how do you approach people here, like working with sources, and how do you stay a human being while also being professional and journalist, while you're doing these interviews with somebody who is heavily affected by the war? How to not cross the line of this person and being really aware of the mental health of this person, so you don't really, as a journalist, interfere much into the space of this person. So basically, how to work with sources, with people who are heavily affected. Are there any tips you would like to share?
I guess in terms of tips, like being sympathetic and just letting them talk and trying not to ask too many questions, because ultimately I think like with the story that like Olivia is talking about, I mean, there are just so many of those types, there are probably thousands of those types of stories, if you range from people being severely injured to tortured, and the stories are dramatic in themselves. You don't need to ask lots of questions in order to sort of get the story, so to speak. But like, ultimately I think like, there've definitely been occasions where, like I've said something not quite, and I've tried to kind of, I've tried to react to that and, pull back and like, and I think it's, I think it's very difficult. I think like it's very difficult, particularly for Ukrainian colleagues, because if you're hearing the story first person in your own language, and if that's a person that you can relate to, that's going to affect you a lot more. And like, although like
but that means that you can be more easily sympathetic.
Yeah, it does, but it's also just like sometimes that can be very difficult to manage with the desk. So, like for instance, you've got somebody who's been very, very brutally tortured, and it's 5 p.m. and you've got to file by 6. So you have to say, okay, like, like how do you wrap up that interview? And like, obviously you have to make the choice that you do the right thing for the source and you push back on whatever else is happening deadline-wise, but you're constantly sort of in between those two. You're the in-between person in that sense, and similarly, like when you witness the mass graves or anything like that, and writing about that stuff in the car and all of those kind of things, and you're under pressure to structure, to write well, to file on time, because everyone's got their own schedule, and so it's like you are, I don't know, it is very difficult. I think that ultimately, like, you always have to try and just remember, like, okay, this is the person in front of you, and this is the most important thing. Whatever happens after that is kind of like, will happen. And also just, I guess, also like trying not to follow up with any questions. I think that's really important. I think once somebody's gone through whatever's happened to them, they've already basically been re-traumatized by that interview. So following up again with additional questions, although sometimes you need it, just try not to do it. Just try and write around it somehow, would be my kind of, suggestion.
Are there any questions in the audience to our brilliant panelists? Okay, don't be shy.
Hi, I'm Marion from French radio. So I'm a radio journalist in France, and I was just wondering about the position of Ukrainian journalists, because we talked with many journalists this week, and several of them said to us that they were soldiers for their country too. So, do you have a reaction on this?
You mean like soldiers of information war? You mean, yeah, yeah. Yes, it's always like you want. I want to be like a hero of my country. I'm not fighting on the front line, but I'm doing like in information war, which is not true actually, because we are like reporting. We are not like sacrificing our lives as our soldiers. Of course, we must stay independent and neutral. Maybe one of the great examples which I remember is big investigation with Kyiv Independent made about the Foreign Legion, and several cases which made Ukrainian Pravda about the problems we have in our country. We're not soldiers. If we are soldiers, we are not reporters anymore, from my point of view.
Any more questions?
Hi, I'm Sasha from Italy. What do you think were the most important mistakes made by foreign press covering this war in the last years? I mean, also before the full-scale invasion. And what do you expect now from foreign press that the attention is fall down?
Any mistakes of foreign media?
Just few examples which I noticed from time to time for reports about Melitopol, like Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol reported blah blah blah. It's how it's covered by BBC or by Reuters. There are no like Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol. It's mayor of Melitopol, because it's Ukrainian city. You know?
The only mayor.
Only one mayor. And another example is also from BBC and from Reuters, unfortunately, like Russian administration of Zaporizhia region or Russian administration of Donetsk or some else region. There are no like Russian administration. It's Russian occupation authorities. You know, it's like the wording which shows that there is a great impact of Russian editors in BBC and in Reuters as well, unfortunately. And sometimes it's happened like when some great media, like very quality media, but they covering in general of possible threat of returning Crimea, and in that case Putin could use nuclear weapons, and they are asking for comments from some political analysts, in quotes. And this political analyst turned to be with Russian surnames. However, they based in London, but simple Google search shows that this Russian analyst, he is like have political education from political science from Moscow. He could not be commentator. He's biased. He's biased in that case. He could not be, and it's a big mistake when you know, it's balanced reporting. It's not, from my point of view, balanced reporting. It's not for that case. We could not ask, for example, the bombing of I don't know, Mariupol drama theater. We could not ask like Russian side, what do you think about this? Because it's the same like we will ask Al-Qaeda, what do you think about September 11? What is your point of view? We must do balanced reporting. You know, from my point of view, this is like main mistakes which are made in foreign media.
Thank you a lot for being with us. Thank you. Big thanks to the panelists and to the audience too. But we ran out of time, so it seems we shall say goodbyes to one another and maybe join us for drinks afterwards for an informal discussion.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to this episode of Covering Ukraine. It was recorded by Oleg Taranucha. Daniel Bilyk edited, sound design and mixed this episode. The views expressed by the panelists are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the organization they work for, nor n-ost or the European Commission who funded this project. The podcast Covering Ukraine was created as part of the Europe-Ukraine Desk, a program that aims at building bridges between journalists from the EU and Ukrainian journalists. You can get in touch with us at eud@n-ost.org. It's in the description of this episode. Maybe consider telling a friend about this show if you liked it. We will come back soon. Until then, take care and thanks for listening.